Hey guys, welcome to Political Fight Club. I'm Robert Durden, and in this episode we're going to be reading Blackshirts and Reds, Chapter 4. The first half today, it's a little bit shorter chapter, so it should be a slightly shorter episode here, and I'll do the second half either later today or tomorrow. It's called Communism in Wonderland. We're going to be starting on page 59. The various communist countries suffered from major systemic deficiencies. While these internal problems were seriously exacerbated by the destruction and military threat imposed by the Western capitalist powers, there were a number of difficulties that seemed to adhere in the system itself. Rewarding inefficiency. All communist nations were burdened by rigid economic command systems. Central planning was useful and even necessary in the earlier period of siege socialism to produce steel, wheat, and tanks in order to build an industrial base and withstand the Nazi onslaught. And if you guys remember the last chapter, siege socialism is a socialism that comes up that doesn't aim to be like utopian in any way. It grows up in a time of turmoil, and it attempts to try to fend off outside attacks to the socialist system and also internal sabotages. So it's the siege socialism they're talking about is like the Russian socialism that developed when they were under attack from the Nazis. But eventually hindered technological development and growth and proved incapable of supplying a wide enough range of consumer goods and services. No computerized system could be devised to accurately model a vast and intricate economy. No system could gather and process the immense range of detailed information needed to make correct decisions about millions of production tasks. Top-down planning stifled initiative throughout the system. Stagnation was evident in the failure of the Soviet industrial establishment to apply the innovations of the scientific technological revolution of the 70s and 80s, including the use of computer technology. Though the Soviets produced many of the world's best mathematicians, physicists, and other scientists, little of their work found actual application. As Mikhail Gorbachev complained before the 28th Communist Party Congress in 1990, quote, "We can no longer tolerate the managerial system that rejects scientific and technological progress and new technologies, that is committed to cost ineffectiveness and generates squandering and waste." It is not enough to denounce ineptitude. One must also try to explain why it persisted despite repeated exhortations from leaders, going as far back as Stalin himself, who seethed about time-serving bureaucrats. An explanation for the failure of the managerial system may be found in the system itself, which created disincentives for innovation. 1. Managers were little inclined to pursue technological paths that might lead to their own obsolescence. Many of them were not competent in the new technologies and should have been replaced. 2. Managers received no rewards for taking risks. They maintained their positions regardless of whether innovative technology was developed, as was true of their superiors and central planners. 3. Supplies needed for technological change were not readily available. Since inputs were fixed by the plan and all materials and labor were fully committed, it was difficult to divert resources to innovative production. In addition, experimentation increased the risks of failing to meet one's quotas. 4. There was no incentive to produce better machines for other enterprises since that brought no rewards to one's own firm. Quite the contrary, under the pressure to get quantitative results, managers often cut corners on quality. 5. There was a scarcity of replacement parts for both industrial production and for durable use consumer goods. Because top planners set such artificially low prices for spare parts, it was seldom cost efficient for factories to produce them. 6. Because producers did not pay real value prices for raw materials, fuel, and other things, enterprises often used them inefficiently. 7. Productive capacity was underutilized. Problems of distribution led to excessive unused inventory. Because of irregular shipments, there was a tendency to hoard more than could be put into production, further adding to shortages. And 8. Improvements in production would lead only to an increase in one's production quota. In effect, well-run factories were punished with greater workloads. Poor-performing ones were rewarded with lower quotas and state subsidies. Managerial irresponsibility was a problem in agriculture as well as industry. One Vietnamese farm organizer's comment could describe the situation in most other communist countries. Quote, "The painful lesson of farm cooperativization was that management was not motivated to succeed or to produce. If anything, farm management was often motivated to provide a poor product. For instance, since state buyers of meat paid attention to quantity rather than quality, collective farmers maximized profits by producing fatter animals. Consumers might not care to eat fatty meat, but that was their problem. Only a foolish or saintly farmer would work harder to produce better quality meat for the privilege of getting paid less." As in all countries, bureaucracy tended to become a self-feeding animal. Administrative personnel increased at a faster rate than productive workers. In some enterprises, administrative personnel made up half the full number of workers. A factory with 11,000 production workers might have an administrative staff of 5,000, a considerable burden on productivity. The heavily bureaucratic mode of operation did not allow for critical, self-corrective feedback. In general, there was a paucity of the kind of debate that might have held planners and managers accountable to the public. The fate of the whistleblower was the same in the communist countries as in our own. Those who exposed waste, incompetence, and corruption were more likely to run risks than receive rewards. Nobody minding the store. We have been taught that the people living under communism suffer from, quote, "the totalitarian control over every aspect of life," as Time magazine still tells us. Talking to the people themselves, one found that they complained less about overbearing control than about the absence of responsible control. Maintenance people failed to perform needed repairs. Occupants of new housing project might refuse to pay rent and no one bothered to collect it. With lax management in harvesting, storage, and transportation, as much as 30% of all produce was lost between the field and the store, and thousands of tons of meat were left to spoil. People complained about broken toilets, leaky roofs, rude salespeople, poor quality goods, late trains, deficient hospital services, and corrupt and unresponsive bureaucrats. Corruption and favoritism was commonplace. There was the manager who regularly pilfered the till, the workers who filched foodstuffs and goods from state stores or supplies from factories in order to service private homes for personal gain, the peasants on collective farms who stripped parts from tractors to sell them on the black market, the director who accepted bribes to place people at the top of the waiting list to buy cars, and the farmers who hoarded livestock when they sold to townspeople at 3 times the government's low procurement price. All this was hardly the behavior of people trembling under a totalitarian rule of terror. The system itself rewarded evasion and noncompliance. Thus, the poorer the performance of the collective farm, the more substantial the subsidy and the less demanded in the way of work quotas. The poorer the performance of plumbers and mechanics, the less burdened they were with calls and quotas. The poorer the restaurant service, the fewer the number of clients and the more food left over to take home for oneself or to sell on the black market. The last thing restaurant personnel wanted was satisfied customers who would return to dine at the officially fixed low prices. Not surprisingly, work discipline left much to be desired. There was the clerk who chatted endlessly with a friend on the telephone while a long line of people waited resentfully for service. The 2 workers who took 3 days to paint a hotel wall that should have taken a few hours. The many who would walk off their jobs to go shopping. Such poor performance itself contributed to low productivity and the cycle of scarcity. In 1979, Cuban leader Raul Castro offered this list of abuses: the lack of work discipline, unjustified absences from work, deliberate go-slows so as not to surpass the norms, which are already low and poorly applied in this practice, so that they won't be changed. In contrast to capitalism, when people in the countryside worked an exhausting 12-hour workday and more, there are a good many instances today, especially in agriculture, of people working no more than 4 or 6 hours, with the exception of cane cutters and possibly a few other kinds of work. We know that in many cases, heads of brigades and foremen make a deal with workers to meet the norm in half a day and then go off and work for the other half for some nearby small private farmer for extra income. or to go slow and meet the norm in 7 or 8 hours, or do 2 or 3 norms in a day and report them over other days in which they don't go to work. All these quote-unquote tricks of the trade in agriculture are also to be found in industry, transportation services, repair shops, and many other places where there's rampant buddyism, cases of you do me a favor and I'll do you one, and pilfering on the side. If fired, an individual had a constitutional guarantee to another job and seldom had any difficulty finding one. The labor market was a seller's market. Workers did not fear losing their jobs, but managers feared losing their best workers and sometimes overpaid them to prevent them from leaving. Too often, however, neither monetary rewards nor employment itself were linked to performance. The dedicated employee usually earned no more than the irresponsible one. The slackers and the pilferers had a demoralizing effect on those who wanted to work in earnest. Full employment was achieved by padding the workforce with people who had relatively little to do. This added to labor scarcity, low productivity, lack of work discipline, and the failure to implement labor-saving technologies that could maximize production. The communists operated on the assumption that once capitalism and its attendant economic abuses were eliminated, and once social production was communalized and people were afforded some decent measure of security and prosperity, that they would contentedly do their fair share of work. That often proved not so. Communist economies had a kind of Wonderland quality in that prices seldom bore any relation to actual cost or value. Many expensive services were provided almost entirely free, such as education, medical care, and most recreational, sporting, and cultural events. Housing, transportation, utilities, and basic foods were heavily subsidized. Many people had money but not much to buy with it. High-priced quality goods and luxury items were hard to come by. All this in turn affected work performance. Why work hard to earn more when there was not that much to buy? Wage increases designed to attract workers to disagreeable or low prestige jobs, or as incentives to production, only added to the disparity between purchasing power and the supply of goods. Prices were held artificially low, first out of dedication to egalitarian principles, but also because attempt to readjust them provoked worker protests in Poland, East Germany, and the USSR. Thus, in the Soviet Union and Poland, the state refused to raise the price of bread, which was priced at only a few pennies per loaf, though it cost less than animal feed. One result, farmers in both countries bought the bread to feed to their pigs. With rigorous price controls, there was hidden inflation, a large black market, and long shopping lines. Citizens were expected to play by the rules and not take advantage of the system, even when the system inadvertently invited transgressions. They were expected to discard a self-interested mode of behavior when in fact there was no reward and some disadvantage in doing so. The quote-unquote brutal totalitarian regime was actually a giant trough from which many took whatever they could. There was strong resentment concerning consumer scarcities, the endlessly long shopping lines, the 10-year wait for a new automobile, the housing shortage that compelled single people to live at home or get married in order to qualify for an apartment of their own, and the 5-year wait for that apartment. The crowding and financial dependency on parents often led to early divorce. These and other such problems took their toll on people's commitment to socialism. Wanting it all. I listened to an East German friend complain of poor services and inferior products. The system did not work, he concluded, but what of the numerous social benefits so lacking in much of the world, I asked, aren't those to be valued? His response was revealing, quote, "Oh, nobody ever talks about that." People took for granted what they had in a way of human services and entitlements while hungering for the consumer goods dangling in their imaginations. The human capacity for discontent should not be underestimated. People cannot live on the social wage alone. Once our needs are satisfied, then our wants tend to escalate, and our wants become our needs. A rise in living standards often incites a still greater rise in expectations. As people are treated better, they want more of the good things and are not necessarily grateful for what they already have. Leading professionals who had attained relatively good living standards wanted to dress better, travel abroad, and enjoy the more abundant lifestyles available to people of means in the capitalist world. It was this desire for greater affluence rather than the quest for political freedom that motivated most of those who emigrated to the West. Material wants were mentioned far more often than the lack of democracy. The émigrés who fled Vietnam in 1989 were not persecuted political dissidents. Usually they were relatively prosperous craftsmen, small entrepreneurs, well-educated engineers, architects, and intellectuals seeking greater opportunities. To quote one, "I don't think my life here in Vietnam is very bad. In fact, I'm very well off. But that's human nature to always want something better." Another testified, quote, "We had 2 shops and our income was decent, but we wanted a better life." And another, "They left for the same reasons we did. They wanted to be richer just like us." Today, a quote-unquote get-rich mania is spreading throughout much of Vietnam as that nation lurches toward a market economy. That's from the New York Times in 1996. Likewise, the big demand in the German Democratic Republic was for travel, new appliances, and bigger apartments. The New York Times described East Germany as a, quote, "country of 16 million who seem transfixed by one issue. How soon can they become as prosperous as West Germany?" A national poll taken in China reported that 68% chose their goal as to live well and get rich. That's according to PBS in 96. In 1989, I asked the GDR, which is the German Democratic Republic, ambassador in Washington, D.C., why his country made such junky two-cylinder cars. He said the goal was to develop good public transportation and discourage the use of costly private vehicles. But when asked to choose between a rational, efficient, economically sound, and ecologically sane mass transportation system or an automobile with its instant mobility, special status, privacy, and personal empowerment, the East Germans went for the latter, as do most people in the world. The ambassador added ruefully, quote, "We thought building a good society would make good people, but that's not always true." Whether or not it was a good society, at least he was belatedly recognizing this discrepancy between public ideology and private desires. In Cuba today, many youth see no value in joining the Communist Party and think Fidel Castro has had his day and should step aside. The revolutionary accomplishments in education and medical care are something they generally take for granted and cannot get excited about. Generally, they are more concerned about their own personal future than about socialism. University courses on Marxism and courses on the Cuban Revolution, once over-enrolled, are now sparsely attended, while students crowd into classes on global markets and property law. With the U.S. blockade and the loss of Soviet aid, the promise of abundance receded beyond sight in Cuba, and the cornucopia of the North appeared ever more alluring. Many Cuban youth idealized life in the United States and long for its latest styles and music. Like the Eastern Europeans, they think capitalism will deliver the goodies at no special cost. When told that young people in the United States face serious hurdles, they respond with all the certainty of inexperience, quote, "We know that many people in the States are poor and that many are rich. If you work hard, however, you can do well. It is the land of opportunity." By the second or third generation, relatively few are still alive who can favorably contrast their lives under socialism with the great hardships and injustices of pre-revolutionary days. As stated by one Cuban youth who has no memory of life before the revolution, quote, "We're tired of the slogans. That was all right for our parents, but the revolution is history." In a society of rapidly rising and sometimes unrealistic expectations, those who did not do well, who could not find employment commensurate with their training, or who were stuck with drudge work were especially inclined to want a change. Even in the best of societies, much labor has an instrumental value but no inherent gratification. The sooner a tedious task is completed, the sooner there is another to be done. So why knock yourself out if building the revolution and winning the battle of production mean performing essential but routine tasks for the rest of one's foreseeable future? The revolution understandably loses its luster. There is often not enough interesting and creative work to go around for all who consider themselves interesting and creative people. In time, the revolution suffers from the routinization of charisma, Ordinary people cannot sustain in everyday life a level of intense dedication for abstract, albeit beautiful, ideals. Why struggle for a better life if it cannot now be attained? And if it can be enjoyed now, then forget about revolutionary sacrifice. So we're going to end on page 68. I'm going to read to you the last 6 or 7 pages later today. We're going to start with reactionism to the surface. Keep fighting that good fight out there, guys. I'll talk to you later.